I first bumped into Scott many moons ago when I was working on my master's thesis, transcribing and exploring some texts in a 15th century medieval miscellany known as the Hege manuscript. Now, incidentally, a contents page had been added to this manuscript in the hand of none other than Sir Walter Scott. It just so happened he had acquired it for the Advocates' Library in 1806 in his role as curator. Destiny, perhaps. Scott was very much a product of his time and its fascination with other times. In the second half of the 18th century, the Gothic Revival happened, and that had a colossal impact on architecture, on literature, and on antiquarianism. This melting pot is all happening within the context, the wider context of Romanticism, the return to nature, the interest in the vernacular, but also the Enlightenment scholars of the 18th century and their voluminous histories and philosophies. And all of this came together and stimulated the beginnings of the medieval revival. There was an explosion of editions of medieval romances and rediscoveries of these old texts and ballads between 1790 and 1820. Incidentally, the publication year of Ivanhoe, if you believe what the front cover tells you. A landmark work of this time was Bishop Thomas Percy's Relics of Ancient English Poetry, first published in 1765. Scott adored this work as a young teenager, and he would sit under a gigantic plane tree on the banks of the River Tweed and read in its shade. And if you go to Kelso, my hometown, and you walk along the river, there's still a plaque celebrating that place. It was this work that reintroduced the ballad form and its historical and romantic subject matter to the reading public, and it was lapped up. This edition isn't the one that was in Scott's young hands under that shady tree, but the fourth edition, purchased for the Abbotsford Library. One of the many ballads it contains is Robin Hood and Guy of Gisborne. From his earliest days as a poet, Scott was familiar with a lot of these rediscovered texts, and he could read them, if not in the original Middle English or French, in many contemporary editions published around this time. He was great friends with the respected medievalist George Ellis, and the two of them corresponded voluminously about Scott's great contribution to medieval scholarship, his edition of the romance Sir Tristram in 1804. If the name sounds familiar, this is because this is a Middle English variant of the popular love story of Tristan and Isolde. Tristan is Cornish, Isolde is an Irish princess, and there's even a half-giant and a dragon in there for good measure. The Abbotsford Library is tremendously well stocked with medieval romances, and many of them are held in press or cabinet N right behind me, to the left of the bow window of the Abbotsford Library. And this was one of 4 cabinets originally locked, and it still holds its 1824 lock mechanisms. These cabinets were where Scott put his rarest and most treasured books. Andrew Lang once said that what Scott did so successfully was make the new world listen to the accents of the old. And that is very true of his particular brand of medieval revival. What Scott does so successfully throughout his poems and novels is breathe new life into some of the structures, motifs and stories of medieval romance that had enchanted him from childhood. Think of the many times in his novels that our hero is disinherited or sent away into exile, or, in Ivanhoe, the use of disguise and the 3-day jousting tournament. All of these devices have their foundations in medieval romance. This enthusiasm for the medieval infuses Abbotsford at every turn. Take a look above us at what is normally known as the Nativity Pendant, or Bethlehem Drop. Now, this is a detail from the Lady Chapel of Roslin, and on the face of it, it looks like a straightforward nativity scene, but not all is as it seems. The 3 kings prevail, but the shepherds with their crooks have become skeletal figures. 3 kings or noblemen confronting 3 corpses whilst out hunting was a popular memento mori story of the Middle Ages, known as the 3 living and the 3 dead, and it was reinforcing the message that such as we are, so will ye be. The introduction of the Virgin and Child into this happy scene seems like a jarring meld, but not when you consider that versions of this story in art and literature would often appear alongside overtly religious images or text. So this carving is like a three-dimensional medieval miscellany all of its own, and Scott loved this particular detail so much that it appears no less than 3 times within the interiors of Abbotsford, above the chandelier in the drawing room and right at the top of the attic stairway. As is well documented, the rest of the Abbotsford interiors are festooned with figurative and botanical details from Melrose Abbey, most of which are 15th century in date. It's difficult to begin to even think about medieval literature without thinking of Geoffrey Chaucer and the Canterbury Tales. And here are his pilgrims, depicted in an engraving from 1817 after a frieze painting by the artist Thomas Stothard of 1806. This image has been hanging here above the Abbotsford fireplace in the study since 1824, the year that the study interior was completed. And it was the piece of art closest to Scott as he sat at his desk and set about the task of writing under the great illumination of his gasolier. This choice has always intrigued me, although it's important to understand that this engraving was wildly popular in country houses of the period for all of the reasons we've already touched upon. Scott's debt to Chaucer is well established. The motif from The Knight's Tale, his personal favourite, of 2 men vying for a lady's hand, often appears as a mirror image in Scott's novels, with 2 ladies and 1 hero figure. Think of Rose and Flora in Waverley, or Rebecca and Rowena in Ivanhoe. Scott's poetry often uses Chaucerian echoes in structure, form, or language. Scott had known the Canterbury Tales since youth, and he talked of his astonishment that all of Chaucer's pilgrims seemed to have so much vitality in such an early text. That seems to me to be the central takeaway from this image. There is a great deal of life and movement, and a real breadth of characterisation. It's fascinating to really look at. But there is also something else. What do the pilgrims actually do? They tell each other stories on the road to their destination. And isn't that a very apt metaphor for how Scott lived, moving through life with the irresistible compulsion to tell his stories to an eager audience? In collecting more broadly, Scott's primary passion was for arms and armour, and his friends and associates knew it as bordering on an obsession. In fact, in an 1831 novel, a satirical novel by the author Thomas Love Peacock, there's a thinly veiled characterisation of Scott, who lives in a medieval or mock-medieval castle and is known as Mr. Chainmail. In The Monastery, one of my very favourite Waverley novels, the character Edward Glendinning is described in the following terms. A loaded hackbutt, which will stand in the corner as quiet as an old crutch until ye draw the trigger, and then there is nothing but flash and smoke. Now, a hackbutt, another variant of the same name, is a very early firearm, long-barrelled, muzzle-loaded, and first used during the 100 Years' War of the 14th century. Now, these early weapons were used to supplement the work of archers and crossbowmen, but their accuracy left a lot to be desired. And what should we have standing quietly in the corner of Scott's entrance hall than a hackbutt? This is quite possibly Scotland's earliest firearm. It's made of wrought iron. The barrel itself, this section here, is over 1 metre long, and it ends in this hook which takes it closer to 1.5 metres, tremendously heavy. But how did it fire? Well, there is a touch hole in the side of the barrel for lighting the gunpowder. There are some grooves around it, which suggests that there may have been a flash pan originally, to funnel the ignited powder to the touch hole. Incidentally, this method did not always work, and this is the original root of the saying, a flash in the pan, and a soldier would then have to repeat everything over. Hopefully, that would then discharge the shot towards the target. This would all have to be done whilst propping up the weapon on a support. This is just another example of how special Abbotsford's militaria collections are, and why Scott was revered by contemporary authorities on the subject, such as Sir Samuel Rush Merrick, one of the founding collectors of what is now in the Wallace collection. We can't celebrate Scott and medievalism without acknowledging what he placed in these 2 plaster of Paris niches modelled on those at Melrose Abbey. But they don't contain saints, they contain 16th century suits of armour. And it's the one here on the left that I want to take a closer look at. In April 1819, in very poor health with gallstones, and prior to signing the contract for Ivanhoe, Scott writes the following in one of his letters. I see Mr. Bullock, and by that he means William Bullock of the Egyptian Hall Museum in London. He advertises his museum for sale. I wonder if a good set of real tilting armour could be got cheap there. And here we have a good set of real tilting armour, or plate armour for the joust. The tilt was the barrier that separated the two knights on horseback and prevented collisions. This type of ceremonial armour could weigh as much as 50 kilos, which is the average weight of a teenager, just to put that in some context. The enlarged pauldron or shoulder plate is the telltale sign of its purpose, to help brace against the impact of the opponent's lance blow. Manoeuvrability is therefore highly restricted. This is the kind of armour worn in the early 16th century, the heyday of the court joust, rather than the medieval joust, which has closer associations with cavalry combat practice. But what this all powerfully illustrates was that the colour and the noise of the jousting tournament was already fizzing around in Scott's head before commencing the writing of Ivanhoe, and that acquisitions like this helped to fuel that creative fire as he reimagined Anglo-Norman England. Ivanhoe was a roaring success, as was its specific brand of medievalism. It was the cherry on the cake for the appetites of the age and the establishment of a national mythology. Ivanhoe became a mainstay of the stage, so much so that in 1826 in Paris, Scott found himself settling down to a French operatic rendition of his 1819 novel. And standing here in front of one of the most medieval views of Abbotsford, where the house behind me evokes 12th century castle rather than a state-of-the-art home, I hope I've given you some idea of how much Abbotsford imbues the spirit of the age, and by association, how much all of its medieval and romantic allusions impact on Scott's literature. Thank you for joining me.